invite you to remain standing for our scripture reading. We'll be reading from the book of Luke, chapter 4. Let's read God's good word together. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit in the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing at all during those days, and when they were over, he was famished. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Amen. You may be seated. Nine months ago, back in September, is that 9 months? Yeah, I think so. Anyway, a while ago, we walked into the wilderness at sunset with no tent and no sleeping bag and no phone or GPS and no lighter for 2 weeks to try to figure out how to survive. We had help, we had guides, but there were a lot of other things that we did not have. And we were in southern Utah. This is a photo of the area that we started out in. And we had eaten lunch, and then we'd gone to the school that was leading us. We signed a bunch of waivers and all that kind of good stuff. It makes you feel good. And they actually did prints of our shoes in case we got lost so they could identify our footprints. And it was like, okay, here we go. And but we walked off, and so we started hiking as the sun was setting, and we went out in the line. There was a class of 11 of us and 3 instructors, 14 total, and we were walking in a line, and as it got darker and darker, our line compressed so that we could see the person in front of us, and if we passed uneven ground, we'd have to say it to the person behind us so they didn't break an ankle. That's a rough way to start 2 weeks in the wilderness, broken ankle, so we wanted to avoid that. Thankfully, we did, and it got pitch dark, and we continued on. We probably hiked for a couple of hours at that point. We weren't allowed to have watches either, so I don't know. It felt like a long time. Who knows? But we kept walking, and then our instructors had us come to a stop, and they said, okay, we're stopping here for tonight. Find a place to sleep, and then they walked off, and that was it. There was no instruction about how to do this, and so we were like, okay, let's figure this out. And so I was with my good friend John. He's been my best friend since high school, and we were doing this together, and like, let's find a spot where we can camp in the dark and also try not to fall and injure ourselves. And so we found this nice tree, photo taken the next morning, and while we were there, we had jackets. We had these nice wool jackets, but we did not have sleeping bags. We did have a cloth. So we had this, they called this a Versa cloth because it's versatile. Yeah, I know. And it is 4 feet by 4 feet. And so we used this to carry things. We didn't have backpacks either. And so we'd wrap our things in this during the day and kind of wear it like a sling. And then you can kind of use it as a blanket, but if you can tell, this is not particularly thick and does not provide full coverage. And so we used this, but it was not warm. We did have sleeping bags, though. Or we did not have sleeping bags. I just said that. We did have trash bags, a different kind of bags, not quite as insulated. And so you can see us there wrapped in Versa cloths. And that was how we tried to warm up our feet. And just so you know, if you're thinking of trying it, it does not help. And so we got the temperature got down. We estimated somewhere in the 40s, and it was a very unpleasant night. And the next morning, John asked me how I slept, and I said, "Well, I think I slept for about 2 hours in 15-minute increments." And not a great night. And so finally it got light enough. We were not asleep, but we had to wait until we could see to be able to walk around. And we gathered up with our instructors, and they're like, okay, we're going to teach you how to stay warm at night. Like, great, thank you for this timely lesson. But they wanted us to experience what it was like to go without and to just have to figure it out. And they also wanted us to experience that we could make it through something that was really uncomfortable. But we made it through the night, despite the fact that we were frozen and totally unprepared, but we made it through. And that's kind of what we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. We're going to be talking about surviving the wilderness and what can happen whenever we leave comfort. We can find life. And so I'm going to be sharing about my experience. We'll be looking at wilderness stories in the scriptures and what we can learn whenever we go through those things. Because you may not go through something like this, Probably most people in the room will not. A lot of you, whenever you heard that I was doing this, asked me why, and I would explain, and the look on your face didn't change. And okay, so it doesn't, if it doesn't sound appealing to you, just on its face, then it won't after I explain why I went. But so you may not opt for something like that, but you'll go through some kind of wilderness in your life, and maybe you're going through one now. We all go through the wilderness of life, and we find ourselves in these situations where the things that we depend on are taken away from us, and we've somehow got to figure out, how can I keep going through that? We'll all find ourselves in the wilderness at some point, either by choice, maybe you're stepping into something new, or by circumstance. Something's taken away from you, and now you've got to figure things out. Somebody that you've depended upon, you lose someone, or you're changing jobs, or you're going through a situation where a relationship is drifting apart, or a difficult financial time. All these different kinds of things happen to us, and we've got to figure out, how can we keep going? And a lot of times when you face those things, it feels like your instructors just walked off, right? And you're like, I could use a little help right now. Does anyone have a manual for this? And there's not one, but we've got to try to figure it out. And so we find ourselves there by circumstance or by choice. And whenever we're in the wilderness, it can be a wonderful thing. It can be a place of beauty, but it can also be a place of peril. It can be a place of discovery and learning new things, but it can also be a place of desolation. And that's one of the things that we learned is if we did not stay hydrated, we could die pretty quickly. And also if it rained, we could die pretty quickly. And so it's okay, we can't really live without water, and we can't really live with it. How are we going to walk this line? And in these situations, they can be things that make us stronger, that help us learn things and discover new things, and they can also be things that tear us down. And so really my hope for all of this is that we'll learn how to experience God in the wilderness so we can take those lessons with us. Because when we open ourselves to encounter God in the wilderness, we carry the encounter forever. It changes the way that we experience things that come after it. So that's my prayer, is that we'll have this encounter with God that helps us to continue forward whenever we face this kind of thing. And so whenever you look at the Bible, there's a lot of wilderness in the Bible. There are just stories and stories. And so whenever you come upon those stories, it's a significant thing. It's they're heading into the wilderness. This is not just a description of setting. It's a significant thing. It's a significant place both in the Bible and for the history of the church. And so it's a place, as we just read from the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus went to experience fasting, to experience deprivation, and also where he was tempted. We didn't get to that part, but after 40 days of fasting, he was tempted by the devil. And so it's a place where we're deprived of things, where things are taken away, and also where we're tempted. It can also be a place of rest, a place of rest. This is what Jesus invited his disciples to. He said, come away to a deserted place. That's the same word in the New Testament, wilderness and desert. He says, come away to the wilderness, come away to a deserted place, and rest for a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And I've talked to enough of you that I know that many of you feel like you're coming and going and have no leisure even to eat. And you're like, take my phone, and I'm going to go into the wilderness, and I'm not telling you where I'm going, and I'm just going to disappear for a few weeks. That aspect I know is appealing to some of you. And it'd be yes, just get me out of here, and I'm going to rest for a while. But it's also, so it's a place of rest. It's also a place of God's provision where God provides for us. And Pastor Tim talked about this last week, about the story of the Israelites after they left Egypt and went into the desert. And we're hey, we don't have any food. How are we going to eat? At least Pharaoh fed us. It was better whenever we were slaves. And then God provided for them manna and quail. And if you haven't had a chance to go back and listen to Pastor Tim's sermon, I hope you will. It's wonderful. And you get to hear a tornado story. I don't have any tornado stories for you today, so anyway, I hope that's not too disappointing, but it was a great sermon, so it's definitely worth your time if you weren't here last week. It's also a place, the desert, the wilderness are also a place where we encounter God. It's a place of encounter, and so we read the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel and encountering God. We read about Elijah going and being ministered to by angels, and then hearing God's still small voice. And again, people encounter God in the desert. And then it's also become a place where followers of Jesus go to experience Jesus, to experience his presence. And so there was a group known as the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and they fled to the desert to escape society and its seductive powers. It was the time that the Roman Empire became Christian, that the official religion became Christianity, and they're I I don't think this whole like church and state thing is going to work out really well. Like that kind of power is going to corrupt. And in a lot of ways they were right. And so they went so they could really devote themselves to God without those influences, and fasted and prayed. And we'll be looking at some of them in the coming weeks. But so there's a long history, and that's some of those things are things that made me want to go into the wilderness as well. And so, I really just kind of wanted to have this experience. My friend John and I, we'd been talking about doing this since college, and we didn't know how to do it. We also didn't have any money, and so that was a small obstacle as well. And both of us are quickly approaching 40, and so we had a conversation. We're like, we're not becoming more able to do this kind of thing, right? And so if we're going to, this might be the time, like this might be put up or shut up time. Like we need to actually do this if we're going to, or else we need to stop talking about it 20 years later. And so we signed up a year in advance and then did it. And after we signed up, we got this gear list of things that we needed to bring. And it wasn't like a suggested gear list. It was actually a maximum gear list. And so it was like, you don't have to bring all this stuff, but you can't bring more than this stuff. And it was very particular. So no electronics, no lighters, no anything like that. And we did get to bring cameras. So I brought a camera, not an iPhone. The pictures aren't great because I'm used to autofocus. So anyway, I'm sorry about that. But these are the things that I had, kind of the main things that we took. So we had a poncho, which could also double as a shelter. You tie it up with paracord. We had wool blankets eventually that we would use, of course, to stay warm at night. But then during the day, we'd wrap our gear up in those and use them as blanket packs. And you can see different kinds of clothing. We took bandanas because you can do a million things with bandanas. We had 2 of those, water bottles, and a cup to cook and eat out of, a knife, first aid kit. We had some water treatment drops that did those kind of things. The teeniest of toothbrush that maybe you've ever seen. It was like that big. It was impossible to brush your teeth without like putting your hands in your mouth, which was great whenever there's no sink or soap nearby. I guess there was soap, but maybe not the most sanitary way of brushing your teeth. My dentist appointment when I got back was fine, if you're worried. Emergency whistle, all that good stuff. And then whenever we got there were a few other things that we bought, like I had a wool jacket, a shemagh, which is like a scarf for a head covering for sun protection, and a handful of other things like that. But not just a whole lot. No GPS, no fire starter, no anything like that. And so we had to figure it out. And so here's my friend John and I, these 2 poor, naive guys who don't really know what they're walking into at 5 a.m. before we had to drive 4 hours to the place where we were in southern Utah. And this is what it looked like after we started. And one of the things that you learn quickly is that looking cool counts for nothing in the wilderness. And so had my bandana trying to keep the sun off that side of my face whenever it was shining on me. And so if you can, it's hard to see with the lights, but I've got my VersaCloth, my stuff wrapped up and then kind of tied up in a sling. And for the first part of our trip, they called that phase of it impact. And it was simulating a survival situation. So whenever we got to the location of the school, it was Boulder Outdoor Survival School. Can't say enough good things about them. But they taught us how to tie up our blanket packs, and we put a bunch of our stuff in there. And then they took them and told them they would bring them to us later. And so we went off without our blankets and a bunch of the stuff that would have been nice to have that first night. And we went, and that's basically everything I had for the first 2 nights, the first 3 days of the trip. And there's my friend John. He was less worried about sun on his face and did not have a cool bandana like I did. And so after that first night, they taught us about how to stay warm at night. They taught us one of the chief ways that you lose heat is to the ground. And so we had no ground, no pad to kind of insulate us. And so they said the thing to do is to gather what they call duff. So that's your vocabulary word today. Basically anything like things that come off of trees, leaves, pine needles, all that kind of stuff, and put that on the ground as an insulation layer to keep you from losing heat to the ground. And so we learned about that, and then we started walking. And we had that one water bottle, just one at first, and so that was 40 ounces. You could also bring a 32-ounce bottle, and I was like, I'm getting the extra 8 ounces if I can. Like, I'm not depriving myself that much. But after a while, we had been walking for a while and had drunk a lot of our water, and we came to what our guide said was our first water source. And it looked like that. And we kind of stood there and waited for him to say just kidding and keep walking, and he did not. And so we kind of looked, and he said, okay, so you know how I know that this is a good water source? And we're like, how? He said, because it's wet. And I said, okay, so that's going to be the criterion for the next 2 weeks. All right. And so we got our water purification drops out, and there were 2 of them, and you would have to mix them in the cap, like 5 drops of each, and then sit for 5 minutes while that catalyzed, or whatever vocabulary word from chemistry I've forgotten. And then you pour it into the water, and you have to wait 30 minutes for it to actually kill all the biological stuff and kill all the germs that might get you sick. And so I waited, and then I finally got to take a drink of this beautiful red water, and it actually tasted good. It was fine. When you got to the bottom, it was a little gritty. That's how you knew to stop. And again, my dental appointment was fine, but yeah, so that's how we started. And we also didn't get any food for the first part for that impact. So they fed us lunch whenever we got there. We started hiking at sundown. And then, not that I was counting, but for 54 hours, we didn't get to eat anything. And so we're in Oklahoma City, pretty flat, about 1,000 feet of elevation. In there, we were between 6,000 and 11,000 with a lot of up and down. And so, anyway, I didn't do a great job of training there. The guy from Colorado was great. He was fine, and walking circles around the rest of us from the flatlands. But we got to go through some really beautiful country, lots of canyons, lots of different kinds of landscapes, lots of sagebrush. That's the short kind of light green that you can see, and then different kinds of pine trees. And night 2, we got to this grove of pine trees, of ponderosa pines, and they told us to set up camp, and we knew this time. We were like, okay, we're going to get all the duff that we can. We're going to be bathing in duff. Okay, I've got a bonus story. I didn't tell this to 9:15, so y'all are special. After I got back, it'll take a second to get there. After I got back, I decided I was going to read the Odyssey because I had never read it. And I was reading, and when Odysseus gets shipwrecked after he leaves Calypso's island, he's washed up on shore, and he's like despairing because he's been shipwrecked again, and he's afraid he's going to freeze to death. And he walks over this kind of like over the slope and finds this grove of trees, and he gathers all the leaves that he can. And it said he was overjoyed whenever he saw it. And I was like, I have never related to that so much. It's like, because that was my bed, and it was amazing. And so we had both, John and I we were not afraid to share heat, because would you rather have your dignity or be cold? It's an easy choice. And so we had our versiclaws on top, and then we put another one kind of in between, so we're able to lift that up, and that was like a comforter on top. And our feet still froze, but the rest of us was warmer than the first night, so that was good. And we made it through night 2 okay, and I almost got lost in the pine trees, but I did not. That's another story. But the next day we got up and we started hiking again and had these beautiful views, except we started somewhere down here. And so that was just a lot of climbing. And as we were getting past around 48 hours of no food, we were getting tired, and it got hard. And yet we continued to kind of just, I tried to continue, my kind of mantra was I get to be here. And I would remind myself of that whenever I got to see these beautiful views. This is a gift, and I'm going to enjoy it, and I'm going to ignore my legs and my stomach and everything else that's hurting. And so we got to just be in nature and see this changing landscape. And I learned a lot, and I hurt a lot, but it was an eye-opening experience. And just the experience of going without the things that I normally am with, having no electronics other than a camera, it was a different kind of experience. And so we learn things that we can't get anywhere else whenever we go into the wilderness. I think that's part of why Jesus went into the wilderness after his baptism. And yet the thing is, we really, most of us, including me, whenever I'm not in the desert, we really kind of balk at any discomfort that we may have to face, because we live at a time when we can nearly banish most discomfort from our lives. Right? I mean, we can control, whenever it's 100 degrees outside, we can generally control what the temperature is inside, right? I mean, whenever you walk out of here, I'm guessing you're going to be like, whoa, this is unpleasant, right? It's Oklahoma in almost July. And yet we can walk in and it's a balmy 68 or 72, or balmy might be the wrong, anyway, it's a pleasant 68 or 72. And we can also get, we don't have to worry about just eating what's available and what's seasonal. We eat pretty much whatever we want when we want it. And if you don't want to do hard things like go to the store or order at a restaurant, like you just have it brought to you. And you don't even have to talk to the person. You just hit leave it on my porch, and then it magically appears. It is quite a time to be alive. And then these things that we used to have to do, have hard conversations to people face to face and try to figure out the right words to say, I can just send you a text. I can break up with you by text, and I can make sure I get the message exactly right before I hit send. It's exactly the way that I want to send it. And if it becomes uncomfortable and I don't want to respond, then I just stop. Right? I just ghost, and then I don't have to anymore. We have all of these ways that we can escape discomfort. We have so many ways of coping now as well. We don't have to be bored anymore. The scroll never stops. I mean, maybe it stops, but it stops way beyond our life expectancy, right? We just keep going. We can just distract ourselves into oblivion. And the reason we do that, we know it's not great for us. We know that we maybe it's not, but the reason that we don't, that we just continue to do it, is depriving ourselves is uncomfortable, right? No one likes that. Do you like walking out whenever it's 110 heat index and just standing outside and sweating? But most of us don't. I mean, I don't. And yet what we know deep down somewhere is that we need to learn that being deprived is often good for us. Not having everything is actually good for us. Are any of you so much happier now because you have access? In the first 5 minutes you were awake, you read all of the bad news that's happened in the last 24 hours? That information is not helpful. Do you know what we call people who get everything that they want? Spoiled. Unless it's us, then it's just deserving, right? It's getting what we deserve. But we call that spoiled, and yet we continue to try to get all of the things that we want. And we see a different example in Jesus' life and the things that he did at the beginning of his ministry. So whenever we see Jesus as an adult for the first time, it's at his baptism. And he has this amazing moment. But after his baptism, he doesn't just go straight to work. He doesn't go straight into his ministry. And so this is what Luke tells us in chapter 3. He says, now when all the people were being baptized, and when Jesus also had been baptized and was praying, the heaven was open, and the Holy Spirit descended upon him in bodily form like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, you are my son, the beloved, with you I am well pleased. Now, that's a pretty good baptism, right? I mean, that has not happened to anybody that I've baptized yet. I'm holding out hope, maybe we'll get the actual dove coming down. We could probably actually make that happen, anyway, sound booth, maybe you can help me with that. But I mean, so this is a significant thing that happens. The Holy Spirit comes down like a dove, and a voice from heaven says, this is my beloved son with whom I'm well pleased. And I mean, that's okay, let's get to work, right? I mean, God just spoke from heaven and told everyone that God is well pleased with me. I'm going to go out and do some stuff. I mean, because I've got divine sanction. And is that what Jesus does? No. He actually goes and decides to suffer in the wilderness for a while. For 40 days, he spends fasting to prepare for the ministry that would lead him to the cross. Because he knew that to endure the things that he was going to have to endure, he had to prepare himself beforehand. He had to get ready. He had to actually get rid of the things that he didn't need, to get rid of the inessential so that he could focus on the things that were really important. And the temptations that he faced, and this is the way that Henry Nouwen paraphrases it, he says, Jesus was tempted by Satan to be relevant, when Satan says, turn stones into loaves, to be spectacular, throw yourself down off of this precipice, and God will send his angels concerning you, and to be powerful, whenever he promises, I will give you all these kingdoms. And aren't those the temptations that we continue to face today? Be relevant, be useful to people so people will look at you and say how important you are. Or be spectacular so you have an Instagram-worthy life, right? You can post all of the highlights and people say, wow, I wish I had vacations like that one. Or whatever it is. Or to be powerful, right? I mean, we all want those things. We want to be able to say to someone, go and do this thing for me, and then have them go and do it. I want that with my kids for sure. I do not have that with my kids. But we want that. We want to be able to get the things that we want when we want them. And in some ways, we're becoming used to that. And yet Jesus said no to all of those things. He chose to take intentional time away from distractions so that he could prepare for his ministry. And I think that's one of the things for us as we face temptation. A lot of times we don't even realize that we're being tempted. Like there's just so much coming in. There's so many things going on, and we're just trying to get from one thing to the next. We don't even realize those things are happening until we step back, until we realize. Some of you all know Courtney, my wife, was at camp this week, and so I was watching our daughters, who are 9 and 3, all week solo, and we had a few nights bedtime was a bit of a struggle. I don't know if anyone's experienced that, but one night it went in the way that it was it came to the point that after I finally got them to bed, I had ice cream and pie, like. It was a 2 dessert, that was my coping strategy, right? And it wasn't even temptation. It was like, I'm not even thinking. I'm just like my brain stem is operating right now, and it is controlling everything. It was just one of those nights, But it's only whenever we can step back that we can actually see the things that are happening to us. And Jesus taking that time away, spending time fasting and praying, it enabled him to see clearly so that whenever he was tempted, he could resist. And in doing that, he sets us an example that maybe there are times that we need to step back and deprive ourselves of things so that we can see more clearly, to get out of the rush of things and the constant having everything at our fingertips so that we can see clearly, so that we can move from deprivation to clarity. But again, we don't like those things. We've kind of moved away from those, and even serious followers of Jesus, we tend to reject practices like fasting and other forms of deprivation, of depriving ourselves. We think of those as kind of outdated and excessive, and maybe you've said this, I know I've said this before, but we're coming up, whenever you're coming into the season of Lent, which is the 40 days leading up to Easter, a lot of people will give something up or will fast, and maybe, what I've said is like, fasting or giving something up is negative. I want to do something positive, and yet sometimes I think maybe we need the negative. And in fact, Jesus actually takes things away. He fasts. That's where we get the season of Lent. It's his 40 days in the wilderness. I think sometimes maybe we actually need to be deprived to experience the things that matter most. And in fact, fasting was a key part of what followers of Jesus did. The earliest document that we have, a Christian document outside of the Bible, is called the Didache, and it taught that all Christians needed to fast on Wednesdays and Fridays every week. It was just what they did. And in fact, that continued for centuries, even into the Methodist movement, so that John Wesley expected if you were a Methodist during his life in the 1700s, you fasted twice a week, just like the early church. And whenever the movement grew and people weren't doing that to his satisfaction, he was pretty worried about it. And this is what he said. He said, "I fear there are now thousands of Methodists, so-called, both in England and Ireland, who, following the same bad example, have entirely left off fasting, who are so far from fasting twice a week that they do not fast twice in the month." Did you know there are Methodists who don't even fast twice a month? You might be sitting next to one. And it's funny to read that. He was very distressed about that. And if we talked to somebody who fasted twice a month, we'd be like, you are serious about this thing, right? I mean, that would be a high level of fasting for somebody today. It would be a high level of fasting for me. That's more regularly than I fast. It's just not something we do. And yet for him, it was like, what are we going to do with these Methodists? They probably are not saved if they're only fasting twice a month. I mean, that's how far we've come. And the reason is we see it as a form of deprivation for its own sake, or a form of suffering for its own sake. And that's not what it is. I think there are benefits to being deprived, to not having access to everything, but the purpose isn't the suffering. The purpose isn't the hurting. The purpose is offering ourselves to God, of saying, I'm going to remove this from my life so that I can open myself to you and be open to what you have for me. So that I'm taking this thing that I depend on, this thing that is just part of the rhythm of my life, and I'm offering it to you so that you can speak to me, so that I can hear your voice, so that you can use me and help me to see more clearly. And so this is something that people have fasted throughout the history of the church. Typically, whenever we talk about fasting, we're specifically talking about food. There's also the practice of abstinence that doesn't just refer to sex, but actually is really giving up anything besides food. And so you might abstain from your phone or from certain forms of entertainment or something like that. That's kind of the language that people use whenever they're talking about this. And most commonly, the most common kind of fast would be fasting fasting from the time that you wake up until dinner time or until sunset. And so, you can have water, you might have coffee, if you drink it black, or tea if you drink it black, so you're not taking in calories, but are fasting in that way, and doing that for 24 hours, maybe a little bit less if you had a midnight snack, but that's kind of the standard way of practicing that. But that was an expectation that Wesley had for Methodists, and particularly for his preachers. And so he had asked them, and they still ask us this today before we're ordained. They say, will you recommend fasting or abstinence both by precept, that's teaching, and example? And so I just thank you all for letting me check this box off for teaching about it today. But I have some work to do on the example part, right? Because it's not something we do. And yet, whenever we do fast, it helps us to realize what is actually driving us. Whenever we take things away, we can actually see what's going on. We can see what are the things that are actually motivating. Whenever Courtney was taken away from me for last week, I could see more clearly that I was not as patient as I thought I was, right? My children helped me to see that. So I did not thank them in the moment, but that's a good thing for me to learn. It's like, okay, unfortunately, it's like they're holding up a mirror to me. It's like, okay, I knew this, but Jesus is not done with me yet. I still have work to do, and that's what happens. Whenever we take things away, whenever we take away the things that we lean on, then we learn. We can see things that we could not see beforehand. This is how Richard Foster says it. He says, more than any other discipline, fasting reveals the things that control us. That's true of food, but not just food. Even just going without can help us to see things that are completely unrelated to food. And whenever we go without other comforts that we're used to as well. Because this is what the wilderness does, and I love the way that the journalist William Longavisha says it. He says, the desert teaches by taking away. We're used to mostly teaching by addition, by giving us information. The desert teaches by taking things away and letting us experience, like, hey, you can sleep outside when it's in the 40s, and it's going to be awful, but you can survive it. You can make it. We learn things like that whenever things are taken away. I mean, it's just like whenever we're kids and we try to do things without our parents for the first time, we learn that we can do it because they've taken away the support, and we had no idea, right? I mean, you had no idea how those first steps were going to go, and yet whenever someone put you down and you could actually try it, you realized, oh, I actually have the gifts to do this. And whenever we get rid of some of the comforts that we're so used to, that we come to depend on, we can actually see things that we can't see. And we learn that God has gifted us in ways that we never even realized and is calling us in new ways as well. And here's the thing. Whenever we get all the stuff that we want, it actually doesn't make us content, right? Has anyone experienced that? Like, oh, I've got everything I want. This is all I ever wanted, and I'm just going to coast for the rest of my life. It doesn't work that way because excess actually often makes us greedy. And deprivation, the opposite of what you think, actually helps us to become grateful. Whenever things are taken away, we learn to appreciate them. And so the best meal that I've ever had after 54 hours of hiking with no calories was that. A banana, and it was fantastic. And probably my stomach could not have taken much more than that after that kind of day, but it was amazing. It was so much better than my normal meals. We grilled steak on Friday night. Banana was so much better than that, right? I mean, because I had been deprived, and I appreciated it more. And on most days, I don't appreciate that I somehow have this fruit that 4 days ago was in Central America and now is in my hands. And by what would seem like a miracle to people even 100 years ago is somehow possible. We appreciate them. Because whenever we get rid of the inessential, we can focus on the essential. We can see the things that actually matter. Because we've stripped away the things that get in the way, the things that don't allow us to see them, the things that cause us to think that all the things that we have right now are things that we actually depend on, whenever they're not. And so as we were doing this hike, I mean, the thing that I just came back to was just gratitude, like recognizing that I got to be in this beautiful creation that God had made and to actually experience it. And even though I was hurting and very hungry, like God had given me a body that was able to do the things that we were doing, that God had given me this friend that I've had for the last 20 years that we could have this experience together. And the family that I missed so much, People have asked me if I would do it again. I would do it again, except not while my kids are young. I don't want to be away from my kids for the next 2 weeks. And that was one of the gifts, is I didn't get to be around them for 2 weeks, and I miss them a lot. And Courtney too. And so when we lose these things, we figure out what is actually essential so that we can experience the life that God has for us. And we get rid of all the clutter that gets in the way. And so here are action steps. Here are the things that I want to challenge you to do over the next week. First, I want to challenge you every day this week. Do something that makes you uncomfortable. Have a conversation with a stranger in the checkout line, if there is a checkout line. Choose to go to a place where there is a line so that you can have a conversation with a stranger. Or walk outside for 5 minutes and then you can check it off, right? I mean, that'll do it. But do something that's out of the ordinary. We get so stuck in our ruts, and I have to make coffee in this particular way every day or else my whole morning routine is going to be messed up. Like, no, it's not. Like, that's a dependency. I'm preaching to myself here because I make coffee in a particular way. I've heard that there are some people who don't drink coffee. Anyway, you're welcome here. I don't understand it. But these small things that we depend on. And so do something uncomfortable every day. And then ask God, as you're experiencing the discomfort, say, God, what are you showing me about myself? What can I learn about how I can offer myself to you through this? And then I want to challenge you to also try fasting. And so the early church fasted on Wednesdays and Fridays. You might just pick one of those days and just say, I'm going to fast for 24 hours. Or I'm going to eat dinner at night, and then I'm not going to eat again until dinner the next night. I know that not eating for 24 hours isn't a great idea for everyone, and so if that's not something that makes sense for you, not because it's hard, I hope that won't be a reason, but for health reasons or other reasons that doesn't work, you might try giving something else. Abstain from your phone for 24 hours, which will make not eating seem like a breeze, right? As dependent as we are on those. But try one of those or try something else. Go without for 24 hours. And then take the time that you would have spent either on your phone or eating and actually spend that time in prayer. And just ask God, show me what it is that my hunger is teaching me. And then one of the things that I like to do whenever I come to the end of a fast is to break it with something sweet. And so I'll get a chocolate or something. Dove dark chocolate is my preferred go-to. And I'll take it and I'll just say a prayer. And I'll say, God, let your presence always be as sweet to me as what I'm about to eat. And it's a reminder that God is always with me, whether I recognize it or not. And whenever I can take away the things that get in the way, I'll recognize it and be grateful for it. We all pray with me. God, we thank you that you're with us in the times whenever it seems like we have everything, and in the times when it feels like we have nothing. And God, in those times whenever it feels like we have nothing, I pray that you would help us to know that your presence is everything, is all that we need. And so I pray that whenever we find ourselves in those wilderness times, that you would remind us of your presence, and that you would use those to help us to see clearly where it is you're working in us and how you're calling us to grow in you. And that we who have much might recognize those blessings so that we can share them with all of your people. We thank you for Jesus and that he shows us the way and invites us to follow that way. And we thank you that he taught us even how to pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.